two events with our Wildflower interest. Tonight we've got Dr. Tim Phillips. Tim and I started within weeks of each other at the University of Kentucky many years ago. Dr. Phillips is a plant breeder. Genetics is his thing. He was hired at the University of Kentucky to do some tall fescue breeding, but his expertise is kind of spread into a lot of different things. And Tim's kind of just chased his own interest too. He's been very involved with the Arboretum in Lexington. I've been on several hikes with him with different groups, and it's just been so fascinating to listen to Tim. Not only can he just give you the common name, he knows the taxonomy, he can give you all kinds of information with these plants that sometimes some of us take for granted and just walk right by. So we thought it would be really good if we could get Tim to come tonight, give us sort of a lecture, give us an idea of the wildflowers that we could see this time of year that are somewhat native and more prominent in our area. And then next Monday night, we want to get everybody to the Robinson Forest. If you haven't been there before, just to get acquainted with that facility, but then take a hike in the Robinson Forest and see many of these wildflowers that Tim's going to show us and teach us about tonight. So when he finishes his lecture, I kind of want to get a feel from you all if you are going to be available to take the hike, and what time we could leave Quicksand so we can make the most of our time, not run out of daylight. And if someone can promise some great weather next Monday, I really want to take you up on that too. So, right, that's right. And for those that are close and can get here, we'll figure out what's early, what's doable. We can have some transportation. So it's not necessary for everybody to drive 40 minutes to the Robinson Forest. So we'll try to coordinate it and make that work for everybody as much as possible. So, Dr. Phillips, I'm going to turn it over to you.
All right. Thank you, Dr. Ditch. My undergraduate degree was in botany from North Carolina State University, and so I really am a botanist at heart. I love all sorts of plants, and for a while I had a reputation of being the rose guy. At one time I had 2,000 varieties of roses at the Arboretum on campus. And the Easter freeze, the early April freeze in 2007 reduced the number from 2,000 to 1,500, so it was a pretty hard freeze. Damaged Japanese maples and wheat crop and alfalfa and roses. And my main job is forage grass breeding, tall fescue breeding. And I've been teaching a grass taxonomy, grass identification class. I'm beginning to feel old. I've taught that every spring since 1999. So 16, actually I skipped one year, 2012, because I was teaching another course. And so this is the 16th time that I've taught that class. And that's a good way to learn a subject, is to teach it, and teach it more than once, to keep teaching over and over, make it interesting to myself. I can change the focus a little bit, and I've been teaching it long enough that the reference book, the grass book that I started with was from 1986, from basically Gemma Grandma, the grasses of the world, from Kew Gardens in England. And the Flora of North America project, cataloging all plants and sort of modern taxonomic treatment. Volume 24 and 25 are the grasses, and there was a grass phylogeny working group, the grass taxonomists that worked. In 2001, they published their new treatment of grasses. So early taught with 1986 reference. So about 2003, then I decided I had to get up to date, and things changed a lot. I have been involved some at the Arboretum, and
there's lights here. Yeah, you can get that back there.
The template of this talk, Todd Rounsaville, who's got a great job. He's the curator of native plants at the Arboretum. I did give him a talk on spring wildflowers, about 20 slides. I've expanded it some and changed the focus a little bit. So he's the source of some of the slides.
Yeah, that screen is just, dimensions don't match up real well.
the sources that I use to get information, when I first came to Kentucky 23 years ago, this Horton and Barber Wildflowers and Ferns of Kentucky, my copy is about worn out because I've carried it with me on so many hikes and in the backpack, and checked off all the things that I found, so it's nice. But the pictures aren't as crisp. More recently, Tom Barnes and Wilson Francis did an update. They use about the same title, so they didn't use an ampersand, but Wildflowers and Ferns of Kentucky, and hopefully y'all knew Tom Barnes. Just a phenomenal photographer to catch a little tree frog in the lady slipper orchid to make the cover. And Wilson Francis, when he was working on his PhD at UK, I was on this committee. He's the naturalist at Natural Bridge, Red River Gorge area. So he's a really good botanist, and Tom Barnes was a phenomenal photographer. And a lot of the pictures from this book either were scanned, or I don't know if Dr. Barnes gave permission, or I think they look like they were scanned by a website that I'll show in just a second. We didn't really have a manual of the plants in Kentucky until Ronald Jones at Eastern did Plant Life of Kentucky. It doesn't have pictures, it has black and white drawings, but it's a really good treatment coverage of the plants in Kentucky. So it's a manual or a flora of Kentucky. And I had this book, it's got great pictures in it. It's basically Shenandoah National Park, the Great Smoky Mountains, and the Blue Ridge Parkway, wildflowers of those three national parks. But when I looked at it to see how old it was when it came out, 1965, so it's 50 years old. But you can still find that a used copy that's in good condition, or like $3 or $4. But it's a great book of the Appalachian wildflowers, southeastern U.S. wildflowers. And here there was a reference to something that's happening next week. So you can come on a hike next Monday, and then Tuesday's down to Gatlinburg, because it's the 65th Gatlinburg Wildflower Pilgrimage. It used to be the last weekend in April, and now it's moved up to the 21st, starting the 21st through the 25th, so it's moved up a little bit earlier. And routinely in this book they said that you can find 200 to 250 different species of wildflowers in a day walking on the trails there, so it's pretty rich. Another great resource, there's several, with Google and everything on the internet, but the plants.usda.gov through the NRCS plants database, you can type in either the Latin name or the common name, just click common name, and for a lot of the things it gives a map of the U.S., and they've just updated that where you can zoom in on Kentucky or whatever state you're interested in, and it shows which counties have reported that species. And there are also pictures, a bunch of images, and it's a great resource. Whoever maintains this keeps it up to date. A lot of taxonomy, plant names have changed, and this is one of the places that shows that. Related links or other pictures, other places like Ladybird Johnson Wildflower Center in Texas. It's not just Texas wildflowers, that's a great website as well, but I'm a big fan of plants.usda.gov. The kind of wildflowers that people get excited about this time of the year, tired of the cold and winter and sleet, the short days, the days are getting longer now, and the sun's shining, it's warmer, but wildflowers that bloom early called spring ephemerals. The definition of a spring ephemeral are they're perennial species that grow in deciduous woodland. They're herbaceous. They flower early, well, before the trees leaf out, and produce their seed crop and complete their life cycle, complete their growth by late spring. And a lot of them are bulbs, have bulbs or rhizomes, many of them do. So growth is between snowmelt and tree leaf out. And depending on the elevation and the kinds of trees in the canopy, we're talking about sometime in March, early March to late May, early June. So at most 4 months they complete their growth, and then 8 months they go dormant. And some of the things that are spring ephemerals bloom very early, in late February, early March, and are finished by the 1st of April, and by the 1st of May they're going dormant. So they're really early, but this fast life cycle, take advantage of the sunlight under the trees before the trees leaf out and shade them. But other species grow and flower at the same time that these do, but they're evergreen. So or they're a little bit later, they bloom in June, but they still are finished by sometime in July. So where you draw the line is what's a spring ephemeral and what's just a woodland wildflower. Just an example of in the whole summer this would be pretty deep shade, just looking up, but in the wintertime when the deciduous trees have shed their leaves, a lot of light can get down. And by February, the leaf litter would have been snowed on and rained on and compacted some, not so tall, so the spring ephemerals coming through them don't have as much distance to get through the leaf litter. Things that aren't spring ephemerals but grow and are interesting woodland plants, so they're evergreen plants, they're ground cover, they're small shrubs, there are lots of these. Ferns and mosses aren't spring ephemerals, but they grow in the same places and they're very interesting. Grasses and sedges. Sedges there are a lot of such species, and some of them are amazingly attractive and very interesting, but they're often overlooked because they're difficult to separate from each other because there's so many and they're so similar. Then there's some shade-adapted plants that grow into the summer. When I teach my grass ID class, the student asks what plant that is, and it's common chickweed. I don't say it's not a grass, don't worry about it. I'll tell them it's chickweed, and it's a long weed. And we talk about what family it's in. So just because plants that we might see next week, or you see when you're hiking around, if they're not spring ephemerals, they can still be of interest, and I'm not going to discriminate against them. The Trillium arbutus is an example of a non-spring ephemeral, but it blooms at the same time. But it's an evergreen, ground cover, epigea repens, so the Latin name means upon the earth, and it creeps. So repens is a common Latin word for creeping, so ground cover, spread. It's very attractive. Partridge berry. I think this is a beautiful ground cover, small plant that's pretty common. It's evergreen. There are very few plant families that have just 4 petals. Multiples of 3, 5, are much more common than 4. Just a few families, Rubiaceae, that this is in. That's the same family that gardenias are in. But this, with 4 petals, the mustard family, broccoli family, Brassicaceae, or the old crucifery family, has 4 petals, and the Hyperaceae, the Hypericum family, St. John's wort, used to be Luciaceae family. It also has 4 petals, so there are 3 or 4 families that have 4 petals. grew up, this is another common name for this plant, is Pipsiscula, spotted wintergreen, Mopula maculata, 4 to 6 inches tall, and sort of evergreen, but it blooms at the same time as spring ephemeral, so and it's just a shade-adapted plant. Ferns, there are many ferns in Kentucky, and both the Warped and Barber wildflowers and the Barnes and Wilson Francis newer version of wildflowers in Kentucky. They also cover ferns, and there's really interesting ferns. I've never seen a walking fern before I came to Kentucky, so that's sort of the long leaf. It doesn't look much like fern, but you turn it over and see the spores on the backside of the leaves, and it's a walking fern. Grasses aren't wildflowers. I've had people tell me that grasses don't flower. But I'm a grass breeder, and I collect seed from grasses when I do the breeding, and you can't get seed unless the plant has flowers, so I know they do flower. They're just not showy. They don't have petals like a rose or any other showy wildflower. And there's some really nice, interesting woodland grasses. Poa cuspidata. In normal years, this would be blooming in Fayette County in the woods at Raven Run, maybe up here around Valentine's Day. It's the earliest grass to start flowering, and it is a woodland grass, so very shade adapted, very early flowering. That's why it's called early bluegrass, and it's a native poa, not suited for lawns, but it's a really nice woodland species. Another nice grass is the melics. We have 2 species of melics in Kentucky, Melica nitens, the 3-flower melic grass, and Melica mutata, 2-flower melic. And they're really quite nice. 1 foot 18 inches tall, sort of shaggy inflorescences. And there are some other grasses that we may see. There's Canada brome, American beet grain, there's the wild rise, bottlebrush grass. There's several nice woodland grasses that are native, and they're quite interesting, but they're not showy like wildflowers. Quite a few sedges are just now getting into commerce as ornamental plants. You can buy them now at big box stores and the garden center. Almost like 20 years ago, using grasses as ornamentals was new. The switchgrass and miscanthus, all the ornamental grasses, some native and some introduced. And that was new 20 years ago, and now some sedges. And a lot of them, you could use them instead of loriaceae. They're smaller scale. This is one that is really quite neat because the leaves look like seersucker, sort of puckery, pancake leaf sedge. A couple of the references talked about how rich the southern Appalachian region is in the spring. There's so many different species in a pretty small area. Within a couple hour hike, you can see literally over 100, fairly easily, 100 species of really pretty plants. And that's more than you can see at other times of the year or at other places in the world. And one of the reasons that was given is for a couple of things. You've got elevation changes in the mountains. So lower elevations is more like southern range, and the higher up you go, the higher peaks. It's like going on up into Canada or northeast New England. So you've got a lot of different habitats, different microclimates because of elevation and aspect. But 2 other reasons that are given: the glaciers didn't bulldoze the vegetation off of these areas and wipe the slate clean, and then when the glaciers retreated 10,000 years ago, they had to revegetate and things moved back in. If the things never were erased, there's more time for more different species to survive and to have a richer flora. And so even longer time scale than that, the Appalachians, Smokies, they weren't under the ocean when a lot of the middle part of the U.S. were. So not only did the glaciers not scrub it clean, hundreds of millions of years before that, it's been above sea level. So some parts of the U.S. were submerged and re-elevated and got recolonized. But these areas floristically are ancient. And that's some of the reasons why there's so many different species here. And one of the neat features of the Arboretum at UK in Lexington is there are different ecophysiographic regions of Kentucky, and they have plants from all the different regions of Kentucky that were collected from those different places and planted at appropriate places in the Arboretum. And of course, the Appalachian Plateaus, this eastern third of Kentucky is where there's a lot more really interesting plants. There are a few spring wildflowers that are more common in the bluegrass and Mississippian Plateau, but a lot of the species that are common here are also found in the other parts of Kentucky as well, and Ohio, Indiana. So there aren't that many species that are restricted to eastern Kentucky and nowhere else. And if they are, they're not that common. You don't routinely see them. We see the things that are more widely distributed and more frequently found. I mentioned ornamental grasses and sedges that are entering commerce as ornamentals. Last spring, I bought a gallon pot of the wood phlox variegata from Lowe's. Planted in the garden, and 2 weeks ago when I was seeing what survived the long winter, and there's two snows that were over a foot apiece. It's up and it's going to be blooming probably maybe by next weekend. So some of them are entering commerce as ornamentals, and they're native, and they're really quite nice. So some of these spring ephemerals make good shade garden plants for the home landscape. We have lots of options for sunny ornamentals, sunny flowering plants, bedding plants, but not so many options for shade. Now we have more options when we can use those natives. Some of the woodland spring ephemerals are great companion plants for bulbs, spring bulbs, tulips, or daffodils. You can use these spring ephemerals. Tom Barnes did that a lot and recommended that a lot. One of the reasons that it's good that we didn't have glaciers wipe off the wildflowers from the mountains is the seed is not distributed very widely, and some of the spring ephemeral wildflowers, especially the trilliums, depend on ants for seed dispersal, and ants aren't like birds. They don't travel from one mountainside to the next mountainside. They're a pretty small scale seed movement. So when the population is wiped out, and there's ants might still be around, but if there's no more trilliums, because they all were dug up or scraped off, clear cutting operation or whatever, then ants aren't going to bring them from a couple hundred feet away or half a mile away, because they don't move that far. And a lot of these early spring ephemerals are very important pollen and nectar sources for pollinators, native pollinators, especially bumblebees. So it's another reason they're important, besides their aesthetic value for us. So some of the plant families that I'll cover and talk about briefly. I'm old enough that when I was taking biology classes, there was an animal kingdom and a plant kingdom. And now there's lots of different kingdoms. I think there are up to 13 or 17 different kingdoms. Fungi are not plants. When I was being taught, fungi were just non-green plants. But fungi are actually closer to animals as a kingdom than they are to plants, which is sort of odd to think that they are slightly closer to the animal kingdom than the plant kingdom. And there was this lily family. Liliaceae is a very big family. And taxonomists have chopped it to pieces. And some of the new families that got split out of the old lily family, the trillium family, Trilliaceae, the bellwort family, Wildflower, the lily of the valley family that includes the Solomon seal, false Solomon seal, Convolvulariaceae, the onion family, Alliaceae, Amaryllis family, Amaryllidaceae, hyacinth family, and of course there's Liliaceae. Smilax is the same family now. Smilacaceae, Asparagaceae is another split from an Agavaceae. So the Liliaceae has been separated quite a lot, and when all that separation is done, there's still a core family of the really central lilies, and we have some of those lily family wildflowers. Quite a few violets, woodland violets, that are quite nice and interesting. That's Violaceae. Ranunculaceae family, buttercups. Araceae, the arums, Jack in the Pulpit is the main one there. There are a few others. One of the earliest spring wildflowers is in the carrot family. And we'll see, that's the first picture when I'll get to the pictures. The mustard family, a lot of them, you don't think of them as being that showy, but I think that mustards is like the canola or the wild mustards with yellow flowers, but there are a lot of woodland shaped, perennial, 6-inch tall with white flowers that are really quite pretty. Orchids, there are more orchids later in the summer. There's some that flower toward the end of summer, but really showy orchids that people get excited about. The leaf-slipper orchid and showy orchid, and showy orchis. Basically 2 species of iris that are quite frequently found. The barberry family, Berberidacea, not that many, but it's one of my favorite early spring. Poppy family, the yellow wood poppy is in that family, but so is bloodroot. And some of the families, I know Aristolocaceae is the Dutchman's pipe family, Dutchman's pipe, a vine, but it's also the family that has wild ginger and little brown jugs. And there are a few other families that have interesting names that are represented in the spring wildflower. So the very earliest, and some years, if it's not covered in a foot of snow for 2 or 3 weeks longer than normal, like this winter, things were not normal coming out of the winter. Really, March was cold. Salt and pepper is one of the common names, the harbinger of spring. And I have seen this the 10th of February in Fayette County on hikes in normal years when it's not covered with snow. This year I saw it last weekend and it was finishing. It sort of has a little carrot-like leaf. The whole thing is 2 to 4 inches tall, and it sort of looks white, and it's more of a reddish purple than black like salt and pepper. But salt and pepper is not a bad name for the harbinger of spring. Says winter's not going to last forever. This is wanting to bloom. Spring beauties. If you've been to Lexington, around Ashland, Henry Place Estate, you know how pretty they can be. And most of them are white or light pink, but occasionally you'll find a plant that has much more pink in it, so in a big population. And it would be fairly easy to select and do some breeding and make brighter colors and maybe bigger flowers, but then it's not a natural wildflower, it's a horticultural product, but that happens even in nature. There's diversity in color and petal size, maybe even depending on the location, how early or late they flower. spring beauties have sort of fleshy leaves. They're in the Portulacaceae family. They are perennial, and they have something like a bulb that's the book on the wildflowers of the Great Smoky National Park and Blue Ridge Parkway. That reference is really good for almost every wildflower told. If the Indians used it as a food or medicine or anything like that, it gives that information. And a lot of the plants were used for food if some part was edible, or for medicine if it had any effect. So if you're interested in that, there are references on using plants as medicine or for food. So spring beauties can grow in quite a bit of shade, but they can grow in almost full sun as well, as long as you don't mow them. My neighborhood where I live in Lexington, a couple of neighbors have quite a lot of spring beauties until they pay someone to come in and spray 2,4-D to control the dandelions. It also controls the spring beauties. And they didn't want the spring beauties killed, they just didn't like the yellow of the dandelions. But all they've got now is just solid green grass that they hate to get rid of. And at Ashland, some years it looks like 6 inches of snow around Henry Clay's house, and there's several acres of it. So, and it's probably 80% spring beauties, and they don't mow it until the plants start going dormant sometime in June. It makes quite a lot of seed too. So the way they're managing it is to allow it to keep building up the strength and spreading. It really is quite beautiful. Bloodroot, Sanguinaria canadensis. So the poppy family has a very characteristic leaf shape, quite beautiful, pretty easy to grow, doesn't spread that rapidly, quite shade tolerant. When I was asked to give this talk, I started working on it and finding pictures, and lo and behold, someone found a plant of bloodroot that has double flowers, and the name of that strain is multiplex. And someone else found another plant that's got pink in it, and it's called rosea. And I've got a problem if I see something I like, I want to collect it, so you can buy these plants if you're willing to pay about $25 for a 2-inch piece of rhizome of the double one. There's only $16 for the pink one, so it must grow faster. And I looked for a lot of different nurseries, and but of course it's like that I don't have the plain one, so I've got to find the source of the original. So I'll have 3 different forms. And these are natural, so if you find something that's really showy and interesting, and you don't have to drive it to extinction, you can propagate it if it's your land, or you get permission, it's not protected space. So that's how these have entered commerce, and people are making money off of it. Bloodroot has this orange-red stain dye. That's in the poppy family. There's the capsule seed to be produced. And I've been told that Indians used the bloodroot for war paint. No, they wouldn't, because the sap of this was used to remove skin cancer before they knew that it was skin cancer. But the sap of this burns, chemically burns, and eats into whatever it's put on. So it's a pretty potent compound that's in the bloodroot rhizomes. So don't paint your face with it. Yes?
Is that not a source for salicylic acid?
Salicylic acid comes mainly from willows. Salix, the genus Salix, is where the salicylic acid gets its name. So lots of willows have that in it. It's a different acid, a different compound that causes the burning. There well may be salicylic acid in that, but I know the main source, or the most common source, and has several benefits as a pain reliever, basically precursor to aspirin or natural aspirin from trees, from willow twigs is how some references say that Native Americans used it. This is a plant that's common in many counties of eastern Kentucky, but pretty common in a few counties. Twin leaf. Each leaf is divided into two, sort of looks like a bow tie, and the flower sort of looks similar to the bloodroot, but it's actually in the barberry family, and it's named after Thomas Jefferson, Jeffersonia diphylla. So that's because of the two leaves. This is one of Tom Barnes's pictures that I got from the plants.usda.gov website, and if you look in the Wildflower book, this is a picture that Tom Barnes used for twin leaf in that reference. Trilliums, we have quite a few species of trilliums. I think this is Trillium grandiflorum. I've never heard them called toadshade before, but that's a cute name for a wildflower, toadshade. And wake robin is another common name for them, but I've known them only as trilliums. The common name is the genus for me in my whole life. That's how I've known it. But trillium for the three petals. Some of them bloom really early and are short or snow